Admiral Bowman, I think that you might agree that the one deterrent to universal acceptance of the atomic energy program would be the accidents, such as we've had at 3 Mile Island in Chernobyl. What can you say to assure the American people that these won't happen again, or whatever you can say, about that, so that we possibly will be all in back of it?
Well, thank you very much for that question, and it's a legitimate question and one of the frequent yes buts. Yes, but what about safety? I can tell you that no industry in this country operates with an eye on safety as closely as the nuclear industry does. And it does so through really 2 mechanisms. First, a strong independent regulator, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but secondly, something that many people aren't aware of and really don't realize, and it is a peer review process. In fact, 3 Mile Island made us stronger. Now, 3 Mile Island, the accident that occurred in 1979, you can't get much worse than that in a nuclear power plant. We melted down some portion of that reactor core. I would invite your attention to the fact, though, that having had an experience about the worst that it can get, no one was injured, certainly no one was killed from this accident. The radioactivity was by and large contained inside the containment vessel that surrounds these nuclear power plants. The systems worked as programmed and as designed, but we, the nuclear industry, and this is part of the time, Donald, that I was underwater, so I'll have to speak in a third voice here. The nuclear energy at that time, in conjunction with the Naval Reactors Program, and my predecessor, 3 times removed, Admiral Rickover, took a very serious look at the accident at 3 Mile Island. And from that came an organization called the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations that operates out of Atlanta, Georgia. It is a peer-organized organization that goes above and beyond the Nuclear Regulatory Commission inspections and analysis of plant operations at our nuclear power plants. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is charged with ensuring the safety and health, public safety and health of the communities surrounding these nuclear power plants, and as I said, they do it, and they do it in a fine way. The Institute for Nuclear Power Operations goes beyond mere satisfactory and seeks excellence and charges these plant CEOs to perform to excellence, to excellent standards. I've watched this. I had heard about it in my 38 and a half years in the United States Navy, but I had never seen it until I got into this job. When I saw the first board meeting taking place, what I saw was a board of directors at the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations. I'll start calling that INPO for short, INPO. I saw a board of directors comprised of the chief executive officers and chairman of the various holding companies and the operators of nuclear power plants in this country. And I saw them literally berating the person who had been called forward for allowing standards to slip even a little bit from the excellence that's demanded in this operation. It surprised me. These were fundamentally friends, but the language is tough. The language is coarse. The pressure is immense to perform to excellence. I would suggest that I could reel out a number of impressive statistics, metrics that are used, key performance indicators that are used to analyze and measure the performance of these power plants. But more important than the numbers and the key performance indicators, I think, is this organizational structure that's comprised of a very strong independent agency of the United States government backed up by this Institute for Nuclear Power Operations. I think that the numbers that I gave as I read from the prepared remarks would not be there if we were unsafe. You could not operate these plants at 92% of rated power 92% of the time if you were unsafe, if you were having accidents that were causing inadvertent shutdowns, or if things were going wrong. So I can't make the risk go to zero. I'm going to fly back home to Washington, D.C. this afternoon on an airplane whose industry has a far worse track record than anything associated with the electricity industry, and we all know that. We accept that risk as a part of our life, of our lives. I would argue that the nuclear power industry has an amazing record when you think about it. I think that this number is right, but be careful with it because I'm not positive, and I will tell you. I think that combined Navy and commercial operations in this country, you heard said that there are 103, 104 now commercial plants, and when I left naval reactors, there were 103 naval reactors pushing submarines and aircraft carriers around. If you combine the reactor years of the Navy and the commercial world, I think it's around 10,000 reactor years in the United States. And we've had 3 Mile Island, and we learned enormously from it. So that's my answer that I give to my Aunt Sally in Tennessee, because she asked the same question.
Admiral Bowman, you make a very compelling case for the getting energy from nuclear sources. But I'm very interested in your comparing the various costs on which you outlined for nuclear energy compared with renewable sources of energy. And I'm thinking particularly, you mentioned the initial startup costs, which are humongous. There's a time limitation in which it takes maybe a decade for a plant to be operational from the time that the plans are first submitted. You mentioned the risk factor. Apparently, insurance companies feel there's quite a big risk factor because the premiums they charge for the protection of the nuclear plant are humongous. Ultimately, those premiums are paid by the consumer in the terms of their rates. And you compare that with the renewable sources you mentioned earlier, which you approved, of course, both the sun, both the wind, certainly geothermal. There are no real startup costs with those. The risk is truly minimal. So how do you compare the two, and why shouldn't we spend more of our resources, more of our federal funds in developing those renewable sources which contain no risk at all and also do provide lots of current?
Well, thank you for that question. Also, I am not sure I'm in total agreement with some of the premise of the question, and I'll address that, but it's certainly a good question, and let me try to answer that. It's a tough question to answer in a short period of time. First, developing full plant operation for photovoltaics and for wind is not a zero-cost proposition. In fact, photovoltaics are more expensive for a solar plant than they are for a nuclear plant. So you have to be careful as you read exactly. The sun certainly is free, but the sun doesn't always shine either. So in the denominator, you have to have that 0.3 factor that I mentioned earlier for the capacity factor for those solar plants. Now, it might surprise you to find, remember at the very beginning, I suggested that we should attack this energy conundrum, that is increasing electricity requirements while at the same time trying to make the air and the global community better for our grandkids, that we should do that in the following steps. First, conservation and efficiency. I've done a lot at my own home. I could go through that, but you don't want to take the time to do that. Second, we should put on all the renewables that are reasonable. And I believe that we should do that before we begin building new nuclear power plants. So I'm all for renewables. I'm all for wind. I'm all for solar. But it is not free. And the truth is, it's not only not free, it's not cheap. I fear that when, I mentioned this in passing in my remarks, when people sharpen their pencils, as the nuclear industry has already done, and start coming to grips with the true cost of new plants as we move forward in this country, they're going to be faced with the same kinds of problems that is driving those nuclear costs that you called humongous.